originating from the podcast studio inside FAM 360's headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. This is the Above and Beyond Leadership Podcast. The Above and Beyond Leadership Podcast is designed to encourage, equip, and inspire our audience through a combination of inspirational stories and real-life experiences shared by other successful and skilled leaders in a variety of vocations. We hope that the Above and Beyond Leadership Podcast empowers each one of us to step out, step up, and ultimately thrive as leaders. Now here's our host, Mr. Matt Maloney.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Above and Beyond Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Mr. Matt Maloney. I am thrilled to have today's guest in studio with me. Before I reveal who today's guest is, let me tell you a little bit about him. He is the founder and president of Serviam Partners and the co-founder of an organization called the Leadership Foundry. He's a sought-after executive coach, an expert at onboarding, cultural assimilation, and leadership development, and an award-winning author of 9 books. Pretty impressive. Our guest also gives back in his spare time. He's active as a community leader who serves on several boards, especially caring about fostering autism awareness, which we'll talk a little bit about later in today's episode, why that's so important to him, and developing young people. So I'd like to lead off with this quote before I introduce the guest. Leaders become great not because of their power, but because of their ability to empower others. And that's from John Maxwell. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest, Mr. Randy Hain.
Matt, it's great to be with you.
It's great to have you here. Thanks for joining us today. You know what, Randy, I'd love to just kind of start off maybe just sharing a little bit about your professional journey, like, you know, going back to when you started your career and what led you to where you are today.
Sure. So I went to University of Georgia, political science major. Really wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. I originally went to UGA thinking I wanted to go into the foreign service. I took 4 years of Russian at Georgia, but I had a little too much fun at school. So that wasn't the path for me. Yeah. So I quickly said,
we all did.
As we all did. But I said, I really need to get out there, get my career started. I wanted to figure out a way to get into business. So I started working for a company called National Tire and Battery, NTB, in their leadership program. And, ran operations all over Atlanta for that company, learned a lot about leadership and P&L and the financial side of business. Very good experience, and had great mentors who really helped me. Met my future wife, Sandra, during that time, which was great. She did marketing for the company.
Oh, so she was in NTB.
NTB.
Yeah, as well. Yeah. Okay.
And during that time, I developed a passion and interest in recruiting and talent. Just something I became interested in. And when Sears bought NTB, I didn't want to work for that company, so I was recruited to go to Waffle House. Oh, yeah. And I was the VP of people for Waffle House for about 4 years. And I ran recruiting, training, and diversity for Waffle House in my late 20s and early 30s. Great experience, learned a ton.
Yeah.
Because of that job, I'm not afraid of anything. I'm not sure you can scare me.
Yeah. Right.
And loved the work, but I was traveling nonstop. I was on the road constantly, and it wasn't good for my family. So I'll tell you, somewhat reluctantly, I said, I think I need to find something that's going to give me a better lifestyle so I can be present for my wife and kids. And I got recruited to Bell Oaks Executive Search, and I was their managing partner for about 12 years.
Okay.
And during that time at Bell Oaks, I came into this love of coaching. I recognize that my style is that of a coach. I always like to listen and give good advice and help people figure out, things that are going on in their lives. And I really refined that interest and turned it into something that I practiced. So in my last few years at Bell Oaks, I really focused a lot of time and energy on being a coach. And I sold my equity to my partners in 2012, and I started a company called Serviam Partners.
Yeah.
And now all I do is executive coaching, leadership development, write books when I've got time, and try to be a good husband and father.
Oh, yeah. So was it really at Bell Oaks where God started to put it on your heart to say, hey, this is something that I really like. I really like developing other people, developing leaders, right?
Yeah. It's funny. I think the spark for that was probably from my parents. They were not coaches. They were just, wonderful parents, and they both worked. But their style was kind of a coaching style. They would really gently come alongside people and help. And they did that with me in terms of how they raised me. So I kind of saw early on that coaching style. And it's just something that I always brought to my work. But when I was at Bell Oaks, I really had the opportunity to do that with the senior executives I worked with. And I said, I really think this is my joy. This is the work I love. And I felt God was calling me to it. And that's what I jumped in and haven't looked back.
That's great. When you look back at NTB versus Waffle House, I'll put Bell Oaks aside for a second, but NTB and Waffle House, maybe just provide some insight. I'm interested to understand this. Provide some insight into back then. Did NTB have, most companies had management training, right? Did they have, culture and leadership development training? Was that even something that was even front and center, or even in the recipe anywhere for developing the people internally at NTB? And versus maybe when you looked at Waffle House, because I know a little bit more about Waffle House and the management style and what goes on there. Naturally, they're a local organization. Sure. So, but yeah.
This is one of my favorite topics. So we did have training, lots and lots of training, but it was typically on new products, services. This is the way that we do things around here. Typical stuff, and that exists today, of course. But what we also had back then, and I think it was more prevalent back then, is leaders took the responsibility for developing their own people. And I think that's something that's missing today. I probably have gainful employment for the rest of my life because typically companies outsource coaching and leadership development to guys like me, to people like me.
You're right.
So I think back then, I just had wonderful bosses and mentors who pulled me aside, who gave me responsibility before I was ready for it, who pushed me. And I will look back forever with gratitude for that period. But both at NTB, Waffle House, I had that opportunity to learn from people more senior who took it as their responsibility to invest in me. And that's something that I feel is missing today. There are some leaders who do it well, but a lot of leaders have just abandoned that and given it to HR or, again, outsourced it to people like me. And
companies have probably almost, I don't know if they've encouraged it, but the system is set up to almost do that, right? I think that, and I'd be interested to get your perspective, but looking at it within my own group of companies in our organization, we want our management to drive and carry the torch of culture in the organization, right? That's their responsibility. But we even talk about it in we're not requiring our management to train and build up leaders, right? We're doing that in these labs, if you will, right? What we're doing, we're bringing people such as yourself in, and you help install a program, and maybe at that point in time, the management throughout the company and leaders throughout the company are doing things throughout the year that are pointed towards whatever that program is, but it's not something that was like born inside the organization. At least that's not how it was within our companies, and so it's interesting that that's missing. And I wonder if it's what created that paradigm shift. Is it because we're so busy, right? Is it because we're, and we were talking before the podcast about the busyness and how we've found ways with technology, we get more packed into our calendar, more packed into our schedule. Did that just get pushed to the side where it was a central element before, 20, 30 years ago?
I think it's a complicated issue. And I think part of it is time management. I think we're just busy. And we don't think about slowing down and really making that investment. I also think somewhere along the way, I'd love to tell you the exact date it happened, but somewhere in the last 20 years, I just feel like leaders stop feeling the calling to develop their people, the sort of that inner sort of sense of, it's my responsibility to help these young men and women on my team become the best version of themselves. I'm going to own that. Yeah. Now, they still exist today, but they're few and far between. You and I probably know some of the same people. But oftentimes, we've got a really talented young leader here who's got a great background. They're a little off track. Let's bring in a coach, or let's get HR involved. Great, and those are resources that you have available. But I wonder why. It's sort of a rhetorical question. Leaders stop feeling like maybe it's my responsibility to develop that.
Oh, yeah, that's good. Yeah, really good. Let's go back before your career, before you were in college, looking back at your youth. and you talked about your parents, how they kind of coaching style, they kind of came alongside you and others gently kind of promoting things. And maybe it is your parents that would be this example, but is there anyone when you look back, because I don't think none of us appreciate it when we're at that age that, oh, that person's impacting me. I think I know it all, right? When you're 15 years old, but is there anyone when you look back in your life that I reflect back, this person had a profound impact, or these people had a profound impact on me, and I can see even some of that manifest itself in my life today?
I'm going to come back to the parents again, and I'm going to botch this Mark Twain quote, which I think we all know. In my teen years, I thought my parents were the biggest idiots on the planet. Yeah. But after college, I look back and said, they've learned so much in the last couple of years.
That's right.
Because, I dedicated my 2021 book, Essential Wisdom for Leaders of Every Generation, to my parents. And my dad's still alive. He's 84. My mother passed away 11 years ago. But, we lived on if there was a bottom rung of the middle class ladder, we were holding on by a pinky. And, but you know what? Both my parents worked. We had love. We had faith. We had parents that their entire life was about testimony and witness. Everything they did was in the service of others. They were servant leaders long before that term was ever coined. So I grew up watching my parents work hard, put food on the table, put a roof over our heads, instill a work ethic, teach ethics and values and morals and faith. And they did it tirelessly with love. And I'll never forget that experience. So that was the most formative time of my life. And when I was in the middle of it, I didn't appreciate it.
Of course.
In my 20s, I look back and said, I was so lucky, so fortunate.
Yeah. I think that we all kind of go through that journey. And I had similar in terms of looking back and appreciating all of the things that we as a family went through. I'm an only child. And so looking at my parents, they were serial entrepreneurs. And we went through times of, prosperity and times of really need. And just looking at how they were always steadfast in what their beliefs were and their work ethic. And I feel like I've observed, not just feel like, but I've observed that some of that today has been pushed by the wayside. Now, not completely, but a lot of that is not recognized as well in the family unit in the home today, and it's unfortunate. But I also think it's because we have so many other distractions today. There's so many other things. I don't know if every generation says that, right? You go back 50 years and this generation, the prior generation was the greatest generation. And I think you hear that often, but I don't know.
It's funny for so many years as an admitted workaholic, and now I think I'm a reformed workaholic. I just remember so many years of running and chasing and moving fast and getting things done. And now, as I think about sort of the second half of my life and the post 55 stage, I just think about how do I find more time for silence? How do I find more time for prayer? How do I find more time for just being present? And what a great lesson I wish I'd known in my 20s.
So let's kind of jump forward into what you're doing today, and just looking at your coaching and with organizations. What do you see that is really missing inside of leadership, and maybe what are the difficulties that you have encountered in working with organizations and developing their leaders, and looking at the organization and saying, I see the same thing over and over, and here's where the difficulty is kind of rooted in?
I would say, as I look across the landscape, and it's always dangerous to kind of look at things at people as a group, but I think that by and large, the leaders I work with are well-educated, intelligent, very capable people. I mean, really talented people. But the themes to your question that I see is I think leaders today are dealing with more stress and anxiety than I've ever seen before in my life. Some of it is, sort of the post-COVID, how do I figure this thing out sort of part of it. Some of it is we're asking leaders to do a whole lot more with less. I think we have, to the earlier conversation we haven't really developed our leaders to deal with the landscape of today. So I think that is a big issue, that dealing with stress. And I also think that leaders are often not very self-aware. They're not getting feedback from people that will tell them the truth. They don't have a candid counselor in their life to speak truth into what, how they're showing up and giving them that insight.
Yeah.
So when I work with leaders, my focus is on initially just building trust. Let's get to know each other. I want to know the personal and the professional side of you. Let's talk about, what your goals are. Let's talk about, maybe things that have gotten in the way of your success. So helping those leaders identify obstacles between where they are today and where they want to be. And then the coaching process is simply helping them remove those obstacles over the course of 6 months.
That path, yeah.
But stress and self-awareness are just two of the big issues.
Yeah, I think self-awareness is so important.
Yes.
I mean, being self-aware of who you are as a person, what you're like, and we've talked about, integrity, being the same like a bridge, right? It's the same in the front, in the middle, and in the back. And I find that, if I'm being honest, in talking with several of friends of mine that are leaders in their organization, how they lead and work in their work life is sometimes different than what goes on in the house. And I believe that, I think you mentioned COVID and some of the stress and anxiety factors. I think those were additional ingredients in this recipe of stress and anxiety, but there's just so much noise going on that, as leaders, to become self-aware, we need to step back and be able to take time to reflect on a consistent rhythmic basis to self-evaluate and self-care, of course, but where we're at and reset. Is that something you talk about, with your people?
If I were to put my finger on this and give it a name, I would say that there's a huge disconnect between what people say their priorities are and where they spend their time. So if I were to pull a leader aside and say, tell me about your priorities, I'm probably going to get what sounds really good. Oh, it's God, family, and work in that order. Tell me about how you spend your time every week. 70 hours at the office. I barely make it to dinner 2 nights a week, and I travel 50%. That doesn't sound like your time investment is aligning with your priorities.
That's right.
And then really where this comes together is when you get people to realize, we talked earlier about integrating, your life. When you get people to recognize that when you take care of your priorities outside of work, in my case, it is faith, family, and work. When I serve those two areas, work prospers, work thrives. But it's such a disconnect for people to embrace that thinking. They think, well, I've got to put food on the table. I've got to work. I've got to take care of all that. And I'll give faith and family and all those other things the scraps of time left over. But that's incorrect thinking.
That's sure.
We've got to embrace and serve the outside work areas of our life, and then work will prosper.
Yeah.
And I think that's the big disconnect.
So when you look at a couple of key concepts, key teachings that equip leaders, the leaders that you're coaching, are there some common threads? I know that there were common threads in what's missing. And so when you look at it and say, okay, these are the things that this is the formula that you need to follow in order to, and I know you talked about removing obstacles and other things like that, but are there some key things that maybe you can share with the audience that they can grab hold of and say, okay, I can put this to work perhaps?
I think I would probably answer your question in terms of what are some areas that I think we all need to invest more time in. And I would say, think about, do you show up as an authentic person? Are you letting people see the real you, or the sort of the secular world, the sort of the fake version of you? It's important that we are ourselves all the time. I think it's important to embrace vulnerability. The best leaders I've ever met in my life are vulnerable. They're willing to talk about not only success, but also I failed. hey, let me tell you where I struggled. Let people see, get a glimpse into who you really are, and maybe and let them see that you're having a bad day occasionally. I think sometimes we get this idea that we need to, smile and let everybody think we have the perfect life. And that, the Facebook life that we often project on the world we all know it's not real.
Yeah.
So I think authenticity and vulnerability, self-awareness we've already talked about. I think, feedback, getting candid feedback, which will help feed self-awareness, is something that we all need to put more time into. And then I would just add candor and clarity are some other areas where I think that we often work in cultures where we have a lot of passive aggressiveness, and we have, put your company name in front of nice, blank nice.
Yeah, sure.
And I think candor is something that we don't practice enough. And I think clarity, we struggle with clarity of communication, clarity of message.
For sure.
So again, I could go on and on, but those are the key areas that I'm constantly focusing on with my coaching clients. And once we master those, get some level of mastery and improve, you typically see other areas of their work lives really improve when we get those things correct.
I think that as human beings, and I think this is probably more so with men, I'd love to hear your opinion on this, than with women. But there's this persona, right? This image that men are, hey, I've got to be the breadwinner. I have to step up. I'm going to solve. I've got a solution for it. I've always got a solution for whatever your problem is. I'm going to try to solve this, and being vulnerable. And someone once said that I'm not who I think I am. I'm not who you think I am. I am who I think you think I am. In other words, I identify myself as, well, what does Randy think? Who do I think Randy thinks I am? Mm-hmm. Right? And that's when, oh my gosh, I need to make sure that Randy thinks that I am dependable, reliable, and you need to be those, right? As a leader, and 15 other things, but that's where that vulnerability aspect of leadership, it's so important, because that puts us in that state of humility, right? Brings us in the humbleness that's required to really draw in your teams of people. But it's true that vulnerability aspect is so difficult.
And vulnerability gets such a bad rap, but some of the ways that we can manifest vulnerability are, hey, I don't know the answer to this. I'd love your help. Or I need your help. I'm struggling. Or I missed the deadline. I own it. I mean, there are so many easy ways for us to do it.
No doubt.
But you asked a minute ago for frameworks and concepts. I'll give you one that I think your listeners would love to hear. And this was developed by my business partner, Brandon Smith, over at the Leadership Foundry, and we use it at the Foundry. I want you to think about something that we call the trust formula. And it's very basic, but very powerful. Authenticity plus vulnerability multiplied by credibility is what equals trust. And you think about that, I've got to bring some authenticity, I've got to bring some vulnerability, but the multiplier is credibility. And credibility is not just your resume. We both know that credibility is, how consistent are you in your communication? Do you do what you say you're going to do?
Yeah.
And you can lose credibility or gain it daily. Yeah. It's not something that you have for life. So, you've got to make sure you're always thinking about your credibility, but authenticity and vulnerability times credibility. And the reason that we put the formula together like that, and why Brandon created it, is if you've got trust, it is the foundation for relationships. It's the foundation for how you show up at work in almost any way. It's how you speak. It's how you act. It underlies everything. It's the foundation. So that's a concept that I think your listeners may want to really think about. When I show up with people, how am I doing with authenticity? Am I showing a little vulnerability? Am I credible? And then also, how are other people showing up with me? It's a good filter to operate through.
Yeah, that's great. Let's just shift for a second, and we're getting close to the time where we're going to wrap up today, but I'd like to just have you share a little bit about your journey within your family, and specifically your son. Your son has autism, and just maybe share a little bit about that, share about perhaps how that has helped shape perspective for you, and how that perspective has then subsequently you've been able to yield and pay that forward in some of your leadership teachings.
So my oldest son, Alex, is 25, and he was diagnosed with autism when he was 26 months old. And no parent is ever prepared to hear the doctor say, your child has autism. My wife and I suspected, but when we heard the diagnosis, it's one of those moments I can remember every second of it. And we sat there, quite frankly, and looked at each other for probably 2 minutes, and we didn't know what to say. But then we said, it's not about us. It's about Alex. Let's make sure we give him the care he needs. So we just immediately, and I think this is testimony to the strength of our marriage, that we just really said, let's do what we need to do. And we did. We focused on getting the right therapist, the right educational experiences. But over the years, I look back in his long life, and so many blessings have come out of Alex's life. He's such an inspiration. But it taught me probably to be more empathetic. It taught me that there are those out there that need our help, that, you can't look at Alex and tell that he has autism. There's no obvious sign unless you spend 5 minutes talking to him. So sometimes people are struggling below the surface, and we need to ask, listen, and really figure out what those things are. So I think it taught me to be a better listener, more curious, more empathetic over the years. And that shows up certainly in my leadership style. I also, have probably come to grips with the fact that I don't think I can allow myself to have a bad day. Now, let me explain that. I see Alex engage every day in a world that is alien and hostile. He shows up every day. His sensory issues are triggered. People say things that he may not understand. He may have a rigid way of seeing something, and someone's looking for a different interpretation. So I see him go to work. He works every day at a global retailer. He's been there for 7 years. He works at our church on Mondays. He's got other things he's involved in. But I see him do all of that with joy. He goes and does his best. How can I complain about not getting the promotion or not getting the client I was chasing or whatever? I mean, it's all relevant, right?
Absolutely.
And I look at him and I say, you know what? What an inspiration for me and the people who know him. I could tell you stories, we don't have time today, but about things that he has done in his life, from being a lector in our parish and reading scripture to what he does at his job and the awards he's gotten. The people he has inspired is mind-blowing. So I have in my home a 25-year-old young man that is very special, very blessed, but also quite inspirational. So it informs every aspect of my life.
Your story reminds me of a song by Laura Story called Blessings, and it's just about how struggles and the challenges and things that we think are issues, right, mm-hmm. within our family or in our life, and how they're really not. They're really the blessings of our life, right? Mm-hmm. They're really the things that actually God has used to make us better.
It's when you really think about what gratitude means. Yeah. I'm not just grateful for my blessings and all the wonderful positive things. I also have learned through Alex how to be grateful for my struggles. I've learned how to be grateful for the things that are not fun, because I think God uses that as an opportunity to teach me and help me learn things that I would never have learned otherwise. Yeah. So I think it's important for all of us, not just to look for all the shiny objects, the happy things, and say, oh, I'm grateful for that. But maybe sometimes say, that wasn't a great experience, but I'm grateful for it. And I learned something. And maybe that was the blessing.
Yeah, that's great. Randy, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
I've really, really enjoyed having you on. And I know you've been inspiring to our guests and helping them understand a little bit more about leadership and how they can continue to walk that journey to develop themselves. So thank you for joining. I can't wait to have you on the next episode. To all of our listeners out in podcast land, thank you for joining us today on the Above and Beyond Leadership Podcast. I hope our daily journeys are filled with opportunities to lift others up as we aim to go above and beyond. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Randy.
Our executive producer and host is Matt Maloney, President and CEO of FAM360. Strategic Communication Coordinator, Michelle Ducato. Production assistance by Tin Dog Studios. Director, John Berland. Creative Assistant, Whitney Berland. Theme song, Connecting Dots by Curtis Cole provided by Artlist. Please subscribe today and don't miss any of our weekly episodes.